To know, to love, and to serve with Bishop Alfred Hughes, a series that listens to the message of Jesus, responds in love, and passes it on into the new millennium.
Greetings in the Lord. This is the final session of our 5 treatments of the Christian moral life. As you recall, in the first session we looked at the fundamental principles in personal morality, in the second session social morality, and then we began to address the 10 Commandments. Our third session was focused on our relationship with God, expressed in the first 3 commandments, and then we looked at the issues relating to family, to truth, and then to human life, expressed in the 4th and the 5th and the 8th commandment. Today, can we focus on the final 4 commandments and treat first of human sexuality and then of issues of justice? And may I remind you, what is expressed in the 10 Commandments is focusing on what is rooted in our human nature, the very way in which God has created us and called us to be. What is revealed to us in the revelation concerning the 10 Commandments, the gift given to Moses and therefore to the Jewish people, is intended to help us whose minds have been darkened and wills weakened to reappreciate and to live that fundamental law God has given to our nature. And so first, human sexuality. The 6th commandment indicates to us that we are not to commit adultery. And the 9th commandment enjoins us not to covet or to lust for or desire our neighbor's spouse. Can we look now at that gift of human sexuality? It's a wondrous gift that God has given to us. And it is intended by God to be given back to Him in the way in which we relate to one another. Male and female, He created them, God says in the book of Genesis. Sexuality affects the whole of the human person, and it's very important for us to recognize that our human sexuality has far more to do than just focusing on genital relationships, because it touches body and soul. In a very special way, our emotional life, which is a bridge between body and soul. It helps us to forge bonds of communion, both with one another in this life and with God. And only then, in a very specific way, within the bonds of marriage, do we then focus on the genital expression of human sexuality as it relates to that unique expression of love between husband and wife and the responsibility for procreation. What we have presented to us in these 2 commandments, the 6th and the 9th, is a call to chastity, chaste love. Unfortunately, in our own age, chastity has fallen on difficult times. It is even seen as a negative reality. But I think you will agree that when we meet a truly warm, chaste lover, we meet a wonderfully attractive person. Can we unpack for a few moments something of what is involved in chaste love? Chastity begins, first of all, with an apprenticeship in self-discipline. It is impossible for us to learn how to be chaste and loving without a capacity for self-discipline. It involves the total gift of ourselves to one another. Now, obviously, there are various forms of chastity. There's a wonderful quotation from Ambrose that's found in the Catechism in number 2349. There are three forms of the virtue of chastity. The first is that of spouses, the second that of widows, and the third that of virgins. We do not praise any one of them to the exclusion of the others. This is what makes for the richness of the teaching of the Church. What is it then that is opposed to this rich teaching? Well, lust is that fallen dimension of our human nature that prompts us to seek in a disordered way sexual pleasure as an end in itself. God wants us to move toward happiness as a goal, not pleasure as an end in itself. When pleasure is the byproduct of doing what is right, it is something to be enjoyed. When pleasure is sought as an end in itself, it is to our downfall. It is sinful. Masturbation expresses a voluntary stimulation of our genital organs in order to bring about sexual satisfaction as an end in itself. Fornication is the carnal union between two unmarried persons. Pornography is the real or simulated use of sexual acts, actually pretending to promote intimacy between married people, but fostering sexual pleasure as an end in itself. And prostitution wounds the dignity of the persons involved, thereby depersonalizing them for the sake of personal sexual pleasure. And obviously, rape represents the violation of another person by forcing sexual intimacy against that person's will. Homosexuality needs to be distinguished to the extent that there are feelings or an attraction in the homosexual direction. That is neutral in itself. But the activity that is homosexual is forbidden because it actually is a disordered way of relating one to another. Now, within the context of marriage, God invites man and wife to engage in sexual relationship both as an expression of consecrated love to one another and as a way of cooperating with His marvelous creative powers, bringing children into this world. It expresses a total gift of self, body, and soul, and so it should be unobstructed. It should be open to new life, and it should lead to the gift of children. Adultery prostitutes that love, and it expresses a way in which husband or wife is unfaithful to one another. Divorce obviously separates the marital union, and the person or persons responsible for divorce commit serious sin. Obviously, also included in those sins against authentic marital life and love are polygamy, marriage to more than one person, incest, and cohabitation before marriage that destroys what it is that marriage preparation should be about. Can we look in these final minutes at the call to justice that is expressed in the 7th and 10th commandments? The 7th, thou shalt not steal. The 10th, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. It's so important for us to recognize that God has intended that everything He has created is supposed to be for the good of the whole human race in this world. He has entrusted all of the resources of the earth to the whole of the human race. Yet also there is a right to private property that need to have a certain amount of property in order to be able to fulfill responsibilities for family and for community and life. It is not an unqualified right. It is very important that government recognizes, even as it protects the right for personal ownership, the common good as well, so that there is a possibility for all to have a share in what is needed. Obviously, opposed to this is theft, the taking of what belongs to another against the reasonable will of the owner. Promises and contracts that we enter into need to be fulfilled. To violate them is a sin against these commandments. And any way in which we enslave other people in labor, the way in which we exercise businesses or professional life, violates these commandments. We're called to have a profound respect, not only for all of nature, but for the environment. And we're called by these commandments to embrace our social responsibility for one another. Remember those fundamental principles we touched upon in our second session on morality? The dignity and sacredness of the human person, the call to participate actively in social life, the promotion of the common good, the desire to do on the lower levels of the organization of human society what can best be done there, and taking it over on a higher level only when that is necessary. Solidarity with all people and inclusion of people in the use of the goods of this earth, and the rightful understanding of the role of human work and our concern for the poor. These are all important ingredients of our social policy. The Church steadfastly opposes any system, economic or social, that runs against human nature and the common good. And so, it opposes any organization of human life that has as its ultimate end economic activity rather than the human person. Capitalism, taken to the extreme, can sometimes move in that direction. Or a socialized organization that depreciates the integrity of the human person and human dignity. Or a totalitarian regime that violates fundamental human rights. Can we recognize in both of these commandments the call to embrace the human goods given to us in a way that truly promotes God's purpose, and a willingness to become detached from them to the extent that they stand in the way? That is our call as Christians.
In a moment, we'll be back to talk with Bishop Hughes and look at how we can respond to this message of Jesus.
It's like coming home again. I like the feeling.
Maybe it's time you took a fresh look at what's missing in your life.
God knows I've failed, but God's never failed me.
Maybe it's time you took another look.
When I went through that difficult time, I left the church, but the church never left me. I'm glad I'm back.
There's a warm welcome waiting. Maybe it's time you took another look. Come home. A message of hope with love from the Catholic Diocese of Baton Rouge. I'm Deacon Bob Furlow, and we're back again visiting with Bishop Alfred Hughes, and we talk about the 6th, 9th, 7th, and 10th commandment as we deal with human sexuality, and we deal with social justice issues here as found in these commandments. Bishop, you talked about the 6th and 9th commandment, which thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's spouse. And as we look at that, you mentioned that it's all rooted in human nature. The commandments basically are rooted in human nature. And how we relate to one another. How do these two really hit us at the front door of our lives?
Well, human sexuality touches the whole person. And, the reason we bring the 6th and 9th together is that the 6th is looking at bodily activity, and the 9th at the heart, what's in the soul. Now, in both instances, they impact one another, but they invite us to recognize that sexuality impacts the whole person, body and soul. And it impacts the whole person because it touches relationship. There's even a sexual relationship with God because it involves our emotional life. Sexuality permeates our whole being. We're totally male, totally female in the way in which we interact with all of life.
And I recall where Jesus said, the law tells you thou shalt not commit adultery. I say to you, if you lust in your heart, you've already done that. So he is talking about basically that 9th commandment, thou shalt not covet.
Exactly. And he's also doing it in the context of saying that I haven't come to do away with the commandment, with the law. I have really come to fulfill it. And then he draws out the implication.
Do you feel sometimes in our race to be more moral people that we tend to put some of these things on the side and just not talk about them and not discuss them? Do you find that?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that in this session we're talking both about human sexuality and social justice, because the tendency in the past has often been to just focus on issues of human sexual morality to the exclusion of social justice. Now the inclination is to do the reverse, and to be authentic to divine revelation. We've got to bring the both together.
And I like the part about where it's the motivation. What is the purpose? What is your goal in this? Was it pleasure, or is it procreation, or is it to express marital love? It seems to me the motivation here, we have to look into our hearts for that. I want to talk about a couple of things here that we maybe didn't cover on. The church's teaching on birth control, on contraception. How does that play into you talk about adultery and divorce or sins against the married life. How about birth control?
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Bob, because it is really at the heart of the church's teaching with regard to marital morality. If we recognize the fact that our bodies are sacraments of the human spirit, then what we do in our body has a profound impact on the way in which we interact with one another. Mm-hmm. Now, the church has never been opposed to the responsible kind of birth regulation, if we want to use birth control in that sense, respecting the way in which God has created us and called us to live. What the church is saying is setting up artificial barriers are a tangible way of saying, I don't really want fully to belong to you. I'm only giving myself to this act for selfish pleasure, not as a gift of myself to you, and an openness to God blessing what we're doing.
And I'm not accepting the gift that God has given to me in the way He has given it to me.
Excellent. And also the gift that my spouse is offering to me. It's reciprocal. It's reciprocal. And that's why contraceptive sexuality is basically a lie. It's not saying in physical nature what that act is all about.
A couple of other things I want to touch on, and
could I just before leaving that, could I say this? Whether we realize it or not, the society's acceptance of this has begun to separate spouses from one another, has increased the divorce rate, has led to the greater manipulation of one another in sexual encounters outside of marriage, because the profound respect for the other that is involved in that very open and unfeigned gift of self is destroyed.
That unity,
exactly,
where they're both together, with in mind and heart and spirit.
Exactly. And so many evils that we're finding creeping into the undermining of married life and family life, and the exploitation of people outside of marriage and sexual relationships, directly related to the increase in acceptance of this practice.
Bishop, I want to talk about homosexuality for a moment. You know, many people feel like that homosexuality is totally condemned by the church. Help us with a little more understanding, because the church came out with a beautiful document, Still Our Children, which is talking to parents about accepting their homosexual children.
And thanks, too, for bringing that up, because the church, in a very beautiful way, recognizes the fact that some people, from early on in life, if not from birth itself, are going to find themselves attracted in a homosexual direction, going to experience feelings. Now, there are different theories about how that happens and whether it's something that's actually innate or whether it's something that's developed over the early years of development. But the church does not in any way regard a person who feels this way, is attracted this way, as less a person or as guilty of any sin. What the church is saying is that the seeking of sexual pleasure as an end in itself is wrong. And it leads to addictive behavior that depersonalizes both the person that actively engages in it and the person that is brought into it by the more active person. And so it is a fundamentally disordered act, and the church does condemn that kind of act.
Yeah, and we see that it is the act rather than the human nature that we condemn. I really wish we had a little more time. I want to get into justice, but I wish we had a little more time about the cohabitation that we find so sometimes very common in our world today.
And so many people who think that they're going to prepare better for marriage by doing that end up undermining their marriages because they have not learned how to make that total gift of self that is an expression of consecrated love, totally faithful love, and later on it undermines their marriage.
So what we're doing is we're acting contrary to our human nature in some sort of way, even though we feel like it's a natural call.
The fallen human nature is drawn in this way.
Okay.
But human nature, as originally created and intended by God, moves in the direction that we've been talking about.
Beautiful. Bishop, let's talk about justice for a moment. And one of the things that you said there, all the goods and the property of God's creation are meant for the individual to fulfill and live out their vocation as God intended them to live. Tell us about what rights do individuals have or responsibility? How we relate that to justice?
People have a responsibility to provide for their own families. They have a responsibility to look to the future and make sure that they're reasonably provided for, and therefore there's a certain need for the ownership of private property. But that's a real right, but it's a limited right, because all of the goods of the earth are intended for the good of people. And when there are people without sufficient resources, we then have a responsibility to share. And that's why Ignatius articulates for us a very fundamental gospel principle. God intends us to receive with thanks what is given to us and made available to us on earth, and to use it to the extent that it helps us move toward God and our purpose in life and our responsibility, and to be detached from it and to be willing to share with others when it doesn't.
Well, we live lives of, I suppose, simplicity in that use what you need and share what you have with others. And it's very biblical in scriptural when it says that it's equally as good to share as it is to keep. And that goes back to our commandment of coveting. I think
that's right.
Very much.
The detachment that we need.
Tell me, let's talk about two things that are maybe in the forefront of society today. Welfare reform, and then we're also internationally talking about world debt.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at welfare reform and how that relates to what we're talking about here in the commandments.
Well, the welfare reform issue is one that really touches home in the church's social teaching. Church is saying that everyone should be able to participate. So a reform that encourages people to do what they can, to earn what they need, to provide for their families is wholesome. To the extent that it does not provide a safety net for those who are unable, emotionally, psychologically, whatever, if that is removed, that's socially irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So many people would say, well, the church is very conservative over here. Or other people might say, well, the church is very liberal. How do you bring those two extremes together?
Well, the two are brought together in the responsibility for work and also care for those who cannot help themselves.
Bishop, thank you very much. And on our next session, we'll look at the spiritual life and our call to holiness. And thank you for your enlightenment on these commandments. And we'll see you next time. Join us then.